Hello! For a long time, I've been wanting to do a painting of one of my favorite buildings in Saginaw. I love libraries in general, and libraries that kind of look like a castle, even better. I've already prepped my surface with some blended gray and white acrylic paint, and I'm also going to be using some gray and white again today, as well as a burnt umber, yellow ochre, and black. First, I'm using the flat side of my palette knife to smudge on some gray paint that is going to just fill in the basic shape of the building. So I'm making the outline of the entire building, filling it in solid, just flat with gray, starting with geometric shapes. Once I have this gray base, while it is still wet, I'm using the tip of the knife to scrape in some of the details and divisions between the different geometric shapes in the structure as a helpful guide for as I go forward. Next, I am adding the brick appearance to the foundation. So I'm taking some white on the tip of my palette knife without washing the gray off, and I'm just streaking in little short streaks and kind of tapping up and down to make little splotches of white that may not seem like much, but when you step back, they definitely give the effect of bricks. Palette knife painting is very impressionistic, so you're really using shapes and textures to build the forms. Now, again, without rinsing off my palette knife, I'm dipping it in some of the black, and by not rinsing it off, this is going to help it not come across too harsh because it's going to blend with the white and the gray. And along the areas of the building where there are shadows, I'm using the same tapping short streak technique to add some of that black in. I'm also going to fill in the roofs with some of this black, streaking downward in the direction of the roof slope first, and then using the same tapping motion to give the appearance of shingles. Also with the black, now I'm going to go in and fill in anywhere where there's windows. So I'm going ahead and just using the flat side of my knife again to naturally round out the curves of the arch-shaped windows. And with the small square rectangular windows, I'm just adding a big streak of black all the way across and then pulling downward to make the little individual windows. Now we're going to add the finishing little architectural details that are really going to make this come alive. And so for this, we're going to take some of our burnt umber and some of our yellow ochre and mix them together. We're going to be making a lot of thin outlines, so I'm also adding a fair amount of water to my paint. You don't want it to be so runny that it's dripping and flooding all over your canvas, but you want it to be wet enough so that you can easily draw it across the surface in a thin line without it clumping up. And now I'm just going to make short streaks with the side of my palette knife to get these really thin lines, and this is the process we're really going to use to add all our outline work. Don't worry, anything that goes wrong is always fixable. You can see on the top of the roof, one of my brown lines got a little too thick in one spot. So I'm just going to take my other palette knife I have here and just splotch some gray right over top of that to thin it back out. Architecture is easy to break down as far as proportion and placement because it is so geometric. So even as you're placing your windows, or as I'm placing these other little brown outline details, I can know where to put everything because it's like, okay, well, the bottom of this window lines up with the start of this on the other side. This line lines up with this part on the next rectangle shape of the building over. So it's really easy to just look at your reference photo and everything is lined up pretty symmetrically and evenly. So even though it can look intimidating at first, if you break it down into simple shapes, it's actually way easier on a building like this to sense proportions accurately and see where everything lines up than if you're drawing, a face or a human figure, for example. For the steps now, I'm using the flat side of my palette knife again to be able to fill in thicker streaks. Now the next part is the highlights. And for this, I'm not rinsing off my brush. I'm still leaving the yellow and brown on there, but I'm further dipping it in a mix of the yellow ochre and white. And since the brown was just laid down and is still wet, it's going to naturally blend. I'm just taking the tip of my palette knife and adding some little highlights where in my reference photo I see them. Next, I'm going to be adding the landscape, and starting with the grass, I don't want it to be this pure, bright Crayola green color, so I'm actually, again, not rinsing off my palette knife at all, leaving all that built up yellow and brown on there, and then dipping into some of this bright green, and just using the flat side of my knife to streak across and fill in this whole bottom area with grass. I'm also blending over with some darker green, and I'm also using this darker green to create some of the foliage that's peeking out from behind. And for that, I'm going to use my tapping motion again, same as when I was making the little bricks. I'm just tapping up and down with the tip of my palette knife, and that is enough to give the impression of bushes and trees. Now I want to add some variation to the sky, and for that I'm going to take my other palette knife that's more of a triangle shape and has a small tip but then a really wide part at the end. This shape really gives a lot of options. For the size canvas we are working with, it was a little too big for me to use for the detailing of the building, but it's going to work great for what I'm about to do right now. So I'm adding a lot of water to my black, and now this is going to be kind of scary, but I'm going to scoop some of it up, and just using the flat side of my palette knife, I'm going to start smearing it into the sky, making sure after I smear some of that paint that I dip my palette knife in water and then smear some water right over it. And this shape that goes really drastically from thin at the tip to thicker near the base of the knife is really great for this because you can get a lot of marbly, kind of undulating organic shapes just by tilting the palette knife in different directions as you smear the paint and water. So that is it. Thank you so much for watching. I love doing palette knife paintings on these really small 5x7 canvases because you can make something really cool relatively quick. I hope you're inspired to try this out at home. Thank you so much for watching again, and if you enjoyed this and want to see more, be sure to subscribe.